Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Michele Zanini, a global thought leader in management innovation and co-founder of the Management Lab, an organization dedicated to helping some of the world's largest and most successful companies accelerate their management transformation to today's podcast episode. Dr. Michele Zanini is a global expert in management innovation with over 2 decades of experience. He co-authored Humanocracy, a Wall Street Journal best-selling book with Professor Gary Hamel, advocating for organizations that are bold, entrepreneurial, and adaptable. His work has been featured in top publications like Harvard Business Review and Fortune. A sought-after speaker, Dr. Zanini has spoken at major conferences such as Global Peter Drucker Forum and leads initiatives like M Prizes to drive management innovation. Previously a senior consultant at McKinsey Company, he led transformation projects and research on tech-driven management practices. He also served as a policy analyst at the Rand Corporation. Dr. Zanini holds a master's in public policy from the Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government and a PhD in policy analysis from the Pardee Rand Graduate School. His work continues to inspire generations of leaders committed to transforming organizations for a rapidly changing world. In this episode, Dr. Zanini shares valuable insights from his book, Humanocracy, Creating Organizations as Amazing as the People Inside Them, offering a roadmap for transforming organizations into dynamic, human-centered environments. So without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Zanini to the podcast. Dr. Michel, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Deepak, it's lovely to be with you today. Thank you for the kind words and the very lofty introduction. Hopefully, I'll live up to that.
Thank you, Dr. Zanini. Dr. Zanini, in Humanocracy, you argue that traditional top-down power structures are a liability in today's fast-paced world. What do you believe are the biggest obstacles organizations face in breaking free from bureaucratic systems?
Yeah, no, that's a big question. So let me try to kind of maybe unpack that a little bit, and maybe tell you a little bit how I became interested in this idea of organizational innovation and manager innovation, and coming up with better ways of managing, leading, and organizing than we have today. So in a way, like the first premise is that organizations are dealing with an array of challenges that are unprecedented, and the whether it's threats like pandemics or climate change or geopolitical conflict and unpredictability in the economic environment, or opportunities, whether AI, robotics, nuclear fusion, you name it, right? So we're confronted with all these different things that are affecting the world, and our organizations are trying to deal with these challenges and opportunities with a management operating system, if you will, that is based in the industrial era, right? And we call this management system bureaucracy. And you can think of it at the very core. Bureaucracy is a mashup of military command structures, so kind of command hierarchy, and industrial engineering. Just standardization, specialization, and other things that drive consistency and efficiency in the workflow. We like to joke that it's a kind of the love child of Julius Caesar and Frederick Winslow Taylor, who is the father of scientific management, right? And bureaucracy, and these kinds of processes, and that are rule driven, very specific, very granular, very formalized, and the hierarchy put together, they made sense 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, when the pace of change was slower, the world was a little bit more predictable, when maybe even the ability to manage was not so widespread. There weren't that many people with a business degree or the finance degree. You had this administrative expertise was scarce. And when information was really hard to move around the organization, so you needed managers and processes to basically do the work of helping people make decisions and spread and move information around. That is no longer the case, but we're still kind of operating with those models. And so while those models give you, to some extent, some kind of modicum of efficiency, give you some modicum of predictability and diligence, right? And those things are still needed. Our argument is that you need more to succeed. You need more than efficiency and predictability and discipline. Those are almost like table stakes. Of course, you need to be efficient and disciplined, but that's not going to make you successful. It's going to make you successful is the ability to, change before you have to be much more dynamic, to spot opportunities and seize them quickly, to create game-changing innovation that surprises your competitors and delights your customers. And those kinds of things are things that bureaucracy doesn't do very well because it's not designed to do that, right? And so, and I can, if you want, I can get into like, all the different ways in which bureaucracy makes this difficult. But that's the basic idea, right? That we need to move to a different system of management, because if we stick to the current system, we're not going to be as innovative, as adaptable, as inspiring in terms of our organizations as we need to be, right? And it's not about just tweaking things at the margin. We need a kind of a more of a wholesale transformation. So, you almost need to think about the equivalent for organizations of moving from, from the BBC to Netflix, right? Or from the industrial combustion engine to electric vehicles. So that's the kind of quantum that we see as necessary to build truly capable organizations.
Very insightful. One of the key messages in the book is about creating organizations that are bold, entrepreneurial, and nimble. Can you explain what those qualities look like in practice and how they drive success in rapidly changing business landscape?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I mean, so the we talk about four capabilities that are kind of necessary. So the first is being daring and courageous. You're animated by kind of a bold pioneering spirit. The second is resilient. You are able to pivot before the circumstances change. The third is kind of innovative or entrepreneurial. You're delivering that kind of game-changing innovation I mentioned earlier. And the last one is, they're inspiring. They're able to amplify human initiative and ingenuity. Let me just then give you what that means. So being more daring means essentially having an ambition advantage. So you have an organization that is able to pursue very stretched goals, that builds, new strategies, that challenges conventional wisdom, and kind of perseveres in the face of adversity, right? So think about SpaceX, Elon Musk's rocket company, right? So their goal is to make humanity interplanetary, right? So that you can't get a bigger goal than that, right? And that's important because you'll never outrun your aspirations. And so, having a really stretched target then induces you to be much more innovative and in the way you try to get to that goal, and it forces you to think differently. So one of the things that they do, which allows them to be so successful, is that they're reusing rockets and boosters of rockets. So before SpaceX, the conventional wisdom in the industry was, well, these things are expendable. You shoot them up in the air and then they fall in the ocean. And yeah, it's expensive, but what else can you do? Well, they kind of challenge that, right? So that's like one example. And by the way, this courage or ambition advantage also is a very interesting way of getting people to be really aligned. In a way, like the mission becomes your boss, not your like immediate superior or the chain of managers above you. There's a really interesting quote from a SpaceX engineer where he said it was something like this, our goal is to become multiplanetary as a species. To do that, we need to go to Mars. To do that, we need to build Starship. To build Starship, we need this kind of engine. To build this kind of engine, we need this kind of propulsion system. And for this, propulsion system, we need to have this valve. My job is to optimize, the workings of this valve and come up with a better spec or something along those lines. But it just kind of gives you a really good sense of like how there's total like transparency, line of sight between what you're doing and the goal of the company, right? And if you have a middling goal, you're probably not gonna get there. So anyway, so that's one. That's ambition. Okay. The second is adaptability. So this idea of being resilient, and resilient not only in terms of bouncing back from like a shock, that's certainly part of it, but it's also about changing before you have to, and kind of intercepting the future before the future intercepts you, right? And so some of the practical markers of that would be the ability to spawn new businesses, like kind of continuous way where there's really no core business because you're continually spawning new things. You're actually reinventing the core. You're growing faster than the industry, and you enjoy some sort of a premium, like maybe your PE, your price to earnings ratio is higher because investors see that you are very dynamic, right? And a company that does this really well is Haier. They're the largest appliance maker in the world. They have properties and brands all over the world, but they're based in China, where they have about 60,000 people. And the company's organized into a set of micro businesses that work together. They contract with each other, and but sometimes they go outside and partner with outside vendors and partners. And the whole idea of the company is that it's super easy to start up a new business. There are lots of ways you can get capital for it, lots of ways in which other people can support you in that. Yeah, it's just, they're continually moving into new areas. They're one of the first companies to get into the whole smart kitchen, where all these appliances are connected, where they have ecosystems of customers and providers, so you can kind of order things from your fridge and you get all the ingredients and the recipe and everything else. I mean, they've done a lot of amazing things, and yeah, it's because they have this ability to reinvent themselves not only once every 5 years when they think of a different strategy, but continually. Anyway, so that's the second, adaptability. The third is in the innovation advantage, the creativity advantage, where you're continually redefining customer expectations. You have loyalty from your customers that is sort of class leading. You have higher margins, right? Because you're able to find new ways of delivering services, better services, maybe because people are willing to pay more for, or more with more innovation on the cost side. A company that is really good at this is Intuit. They're a financial services company. They're makers of the software, which is now all online, that does your taxes and accounting and those kinds of things. And the whole company was rewired by the founder so that innovation was something that everybody did all the time. So they're training employees in design thinking. Literally every one of their, I forget how many, but maybe 10,000 people knows how to do design thinking. They get trained in that. They have they get coaching from black belts who are supporting them. They have 10% time, so they can work on innovative projects outside of their usual job. They're able to access experimental capital, so they can try a new idea, right? And with their customers, and there are ways in which the supportive functions, whether it's finance, HR, IT, are enabling of this. Typically, most companies, as soon as you try to do something with a customer to understand them better and so on, it's really difficult to do that. It gets shut down. But at Intuit, there are easy ways to do that. Yeah, and there are, again, multiple sources of capital. If your idea goes well and you want to scale, it's not that if your boss says no, perhaps there's someone else who is interested in taking it forward and so on. It's a little bit like Silicon Valley, where there isn't just one VC, right? There are many VCs, so Intuit operates a little bit like that. Haier does too as well. So anyway, so that's the that's an example of innovation kind of taking really seriously. And then the last one is this idea of the human advantage, kind of the passion advantage or inspiration advantage, where you're able to unleash a torrent of ingenuity. You are able to attract and retain top talent. You're inspiring people really to push themselves, beyond what's required or expected of them based on the job spec. And all the companies that I mentioned to you before do this. And in a way, this is the most foundational. It's in a way what we call humanocracy, because if you don't have this kind of human advantage, or if you're not able to unleash the ingenuity of people, and the initiative of people, you're not going to be more innovative. And if you're not more innovative, you're not going to be more adaptable and resilient. And if you're not going to do that, then it's hard to be truly mission driven, and your mission becomes like a slogan that no one really kind of takes seriously, right? So I can give some other examples of that. But where one of the things that maybe I'll just make this quick mention, Deepak, one of the companies that is part of the new edition of the book of Humanocracy, which will come out in the United States at the end of August, is Ingersoll Rand, which is an industrial company. And a few years ago, they did a few things which were quite remarkable. They made all blue collar workers, all non-managerial employees, rather, shareholders in the company. They gifted them quite a bit of shares. It was about 40% of their salary. So, and they told them, like, you are now owners of this company. So, it's your factory, it's your tools, not someone else's, right? And then the other thing they did is they trained them on how to be really good problem solvers, business problem solvers, and they gave them the opportunity to then go and, a lot more autonomy, fewer layers, and so on. So where they could actually, deal with operational problems and commercial problems on their own without necessarily asking for permission or without a lot of hurdles. And that has made an enormous difference to the productivity of the company. Attrition rates have plummeted. Uh, and it's just the kind of thing that happens when people do think, feel, and act like owners. And that's really important if you want to have a company that is truly kind of inspiring and engaging. So those are the four things we said, right? So daring, and I give you the example of SpaceX, adaptable, and we talked about hire, creative, talked about intuit, and inspiring, kind of all of them, plus this kind of Ingersoll Rand example that I quickly sketched out.
Dr. Michel, in your research, you observed how many companies have been trapped by outdated management systems. What are some of the most common bureaucratic practices that hold organizations back?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, bureaucracy is a fairly, it sounds very old-fashioned, a little bit like horsepower, right? In a way, it is, but it's a pretty universal template. So I'll just rattle off a few. So there's a formal hierarchy, right? And you have like 7 or more layers. Authority and compensation are correlate correlate heavily with rank. So where you sit determines how much you get paid and your decision rights and all of that. Typically, allocation of resources and strategy setting is done top down, starting with the executives. The way you promote people is that you have big leaders who choose little leaders, right? It's you get sucked upstairs by your boss, right? It's not necessarily that you're lifted up by the people that work with you, where you have central staff groups, finance, HR, and so on, that are very imperious. They create policy, they ensure compliance, have all sorts of kind of very scripted ways of doing that, where you have roles that are very well defined and fairly narrow, right? Your job is to do this, and that's the only thing you should care for, right? Where you have coordination that happens, but it's mostly through kind of committees um, or maybe someone deciding what to do, right? You're kind of integrating, whether it's a czar or a senior executive is in charge of that particular project or whatever, where, people basically, promotion is a non-zero sum game, right? So you might have 8 people reporting to someone. When that person, moves up, there's a slot that opens, and it's only going to be one of those people that takes that slot, right? And so it's promotion is a bit of a competition, and where, yeah, there's a lot of rules on a lot of things that are scripted. I think that describes, I think, 95%, 98% of large scale organizations around the world, whether you're talking about a prison or hospital or, a Fortune 500 company or a large company in India. I mean, I think they all kind of conform to this template in
Hum-
one, more or less, but I think there are more commonalities than there are differences.
yeah. Humanocracy lays out several building blocks for transformation, like motivation, models, mindset, mobilization, and migration. Which of these building blocks do you see as the most critical for leaders to focus on first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think the motivation is the most important one, because if you don't see the need to do this, right? If you don't, you're unlikely to have the stomach or the imagination to see it through. Because we're not talking, as I mentioned before, about a small change. We're talking about a fairly large, substantial change in the way you're organized, you operate. So you have to basically get to the point where you say, like, this, there's no choice, we have to do this, right? And And in leaders that have done this, I've seen kind of two versions of this, and often they're together, like two strands of thinking about why we need to do this. One is kind of the pragmatic one, like we are not winning anymore in the marketplace. I see us running out of road very quickly. We need to think differently, and none of the things that we've done so far has made much of a difference, and therefore we need to kind of take the leap. Sometimes this comes at you much faster, where you're like, I'm almost having a near death experience. The company's about to die, and so we need to be really radical, right? So I've seen that too. I've seen both versions of that. The other way to kind of the other way into this is to people saying it's just simply wrong. It's enormous amount of wasted talent and initiative and ingenuity. We just can't treat people like this. People are, the CEO of Hire, well, longtime CEO of Hire now, he's emeritus now. Jean Rumin basically told us about 10, 15 years ago that, what inspired him to pursue these kinds of changes at Hire was this idea that people are, he was citing Immanuel Kant and basically saying people are ends in themselves and not instruments, right? People are not resources; they're resourceful. And I mean, it sounds like a silly wordplay, but it isn't if you think deeply about it, and then you kind of flow through the implications of that, right? Which are pretty profound. So I think it's often like a combination of very practical motivations as well as kind of this moral imperative that pushes leaders and others to kind of make these kinds of changes. And I think if you don't have that, then all the other things, you might try them, but then you might find, because the second, so motivation was number one, models I think was number two, and uh models is, some of the examples I mentioned to you, and you could always say, well, yeah, but that wouldn't work in my industry, or I can't imagine um, doing this here, right? You can kind of find a way to dismiss it, and then the migration becomes really hard because it's not something you can do in 6 months, and so you need to kind of persevere. And if you don't have the determination, you're not going to do that. And again, the mindsets piece is important too, right? Because making this kind of change isn't just a big change for the organization, but for the leaders themselves. Right? They need to go from kind of command and control to more like encourage, right, and enable others. And that's a shift that is hard to make unless you really want to do it. So, long answer to your question.
Yeah, thank
Hopefully,
you.
somewhat insightful.
Yeah. Uh, Dr. Zanini, one of the principles of humanocracy is creating a meritocracy within organizations. How does meritocracy contribute to the success of organization, and what steps should leaders take to ensure it thrives?
Well, that's a good question. Meritocracy, at least here in the U.S., at some point got kind of a bad name. But it's hard to, I think, argue with the fact that you want organizations where influence and authority and status and decision rights and even compensation flows to the people that are adding the most value. I mean, it seems fairly obvious to me. And in a way, the paradox is that bureaucracy was invented, right, to do that, to prevent nepotism and kind of other idiosyncratic ways for people to just take the reins of organizations when they didn't deserve it. But the problem is that bureaucracy assumes people are robots, and they're not, right? So they're political animals, and so there are all sorts of ways in which and non companies are not meritocratic. Some of them are, political behaviors and, but I support you, you support me, and so on. But part of it is also that we have very kind of narrow view of what constitutes merit, and a lot of it inside of organizations is this idea that you're just a good manager or a good administrator, or that you move up this administrative hierarchy and you become ever more influential because you become an ever better manager. But like there are so many other things that people can contribute to it. Administrative skills are one, but there's so many others. Even one of the things that is infuriating to me is this idea that to move up the organization, you have to become a manager, even though you're like maybe an excellent programmer or individual contributor. And I know a lot of people don't want to necessarily go manage other people or deal with process and all this stuff. They'd rather do their own thing, but they can't unless they just want to stay at the same level they are now, right? So those are some of the ways. I mean, we're just organizations that are real. This certainly better than pre-industrial organizations, but they still have a lot of bias, right? And it has to do with, as I said, you prioritize certain skills over others reflexively, and then like your career, even though there are mechanisms to make sure you get a fair hearing, but your career is in the hands of your boss, right? And if your boss doesn't like you, then like you're not going to necessarily advance, right? In fact, I mean, I think there's some Gallup, the survey company, the studies showing that most people would, have quit a job in the past because they wanted to get rid of a boss that they didn't like or they couldn't work with. Another study I think showed that maybe more than a third were willing to take a pay cut if they could fire their boss, right? So it's obvious to me like the mechanism for matching influence and wisdom to value added doesn't quite work, and it's really really important to do that. If you want, I can give you an example of a very different model of kind of adjudicating value added in a more meritocratic way. Would that be helpful, Deepak?
Yeah, absolutely, please.
So I'll give you this example. This comes from W. Gore, which is a materials and maker. They make Gore-Tex, a bunch of other things. I mean, they have thousands of products of all kinds, guitar strings. They invented Gore-Tex. They do medical products. Anyway, very, very innovative company. And the guy that founded it, Bill Gore, wanted to have a company that was lateral and not vertical. It was more of a lattice than a hierarchy. And so the whole company is organized in a very flat way where you have teams that come together when people decide to work with each other and they make commitments to each other. So you end up working on several projects as a scientist or marketing person, many projects in the course of the year. The way they then determine compensation is as follows. You basically need to put at the end of the year a list of all the people you worked with, right? And everybody does this. And then the people that you worked with get get to be asked, like, how valuable was this person's contribution? So let's say that you and I, both had experience with Mary, right? And then Mary will be, will tee up various people that she worked with kind of at random, but in a pairwise comparison. So it'll be Deepak and Michele, and Mary needs to decide out of these two people who added the most value to the company over the course of the year, right? Very simple question. It's all about like value creation, subjective to be sure, but the idea is that you have like tens and tens of these pairwise comparisons. So you kind of get the bias out, right? Because you have all these different people had a view into your work. And so hopefully it'll average out and the bias will go away. And then what typically emerges is a fairly clear hierarchy of contribution. So like, it's not like everybody contributed the same amount. Some contributed more than others. And this it's kind of a peer-to-peer peer review in a way of understanding who added the most value. And then there are ways in which this gets calibrated by function, by country. So there are committees that help make sure that this all makes sense. And we can get into that if you want. But so it's not 100% driven by this peer rating, but it's like 90% driven by that. And that creates a very different dynamic, right? Because you can't just suck up to your boss, right? You're working, like, everybody you work with will have a view on how well you did at the end of the year. So you're going to be collaborative. You're going to be, right? You're going to be much more willing to help other people. And you expect others to help you too, right? And so that's a very, very different way of doing this. And I think it's a better way in terms of aligning, as I said, influence, decision rights, compensation with real merit, with real kind of value added.
Dr. Zani, the book also talks about the need for activating a pro-change coalition. How can leaders mobilize people across all levels of the organization to join this coalition and drive transformation together?
Yeah, I mean that's a really important point, right? Because even if you are like an executive who's very motivated, right, who wants to drive change, there's only so much you can do, right? There's only so many hours in the day. You can't just force people, and often these messages can get diluted as they move down the chain of command, right? And so what we advocate for is, yeah, sure, it's helpful to have to stop down pressure, but you also need to have bottom up support, the kind of organic kind of energy for change. And there are a few ways of doing it. One is, I mean, I'll just give you a couple. One, and we talk about this in the book, Michelin, their tire making company, their production process was hitting the limits of its kind of productivity improvements. They were tried all the typical Management 1.0 playbook, lean, Kaizen, all those things. And what they realized in the process of doing that, they hamstrung everybody. They really restricted their ability to innovate and try new things. And so they said, let's find a way to rethink how we do manufacturing. And instead of creating an initiative top down that would tell people like, this is how it's going to change, here's what you'll do differently, and so on, they basically said, we're looking for volunteers who are willing to try new ways of managing and producing and manufacturing. And we want to run an experiment for the course of a year. And, there'll be some parameters and guardrails rails to make sure like we're doing things correctly and productively and so on. But these teams will be challenged to try new things. And they ended up recruiting about 38 teams from 17 different plants. They have about 60 plants, about 1,500 people. I mean, so that's kind of a small fraction of the entire workforce in production. I think it was probably 50, 60,000 people. But, they went for the people that really were change oriented, that wanted to try new things, right? And that kind of phase of experimentation was incredibly successful, to the point where then, after a year, they said, okay, well, how do we do this at the plant level? Because they were working with teams in a plant. So there were like many different teams in a plant that were focused on particular areas of production, not the whole thing. And so they, Michelin plant manager said, I want to volunteer my entire plant, not just one team. And so they ended up recruiting several plants who were running bigger and bolder experiments. And then, then they kind of continued and thought about, okay, how do we then change support functions at the center to help enable the plants to be more independent and so on. So that's just one example of how you can actually start quite small, but then propagate the change throughout the organization. There are many others. But the idea is, and there are examples of, and I've done some of this work personally with Gary Hamel, my partner, where you help CEOs, start a conversation. I mean, you don't have to do it. I mean, you can do it on the plant, in, but you can also do it, in an office environment where you're just inviting people to a company-wide conversation around how do we become more innovative, for instance, right? And you just over several kind of discussions and staged kind of efforts, you develop a consensus and a shared point of view from people that really want to help out, right? And so that's what I would do. Like I would, you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a former McKinsey consultant, but I would tell you, I would not go down the traditional consulting change management route. I would, in a way, do the opposite, which is, start from, start, be much more experimental, much more organic, less scripted. Yes, you have to have some framework, but within that, you need to kind of evolve the system and let the users, right? Let the people, especially at the front line, who have great expertise and energy, have them invent the new, as opposed to kind of, telling them what the new is.
Dr. Mikhil, my last question. For someone listening this episode who is frustrated with bureaucratic systems but unsure where to start, what would you say is the first step they can take to move towards creating a more human-centric agile organization?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm assuming, if you want, I can give you then the version for maybe the non-manager. But let me just start with managers who are listening, who are saying, okay, I want to increase the level of achievement and, my team move away some of the impediments, right, that my team faces. So my suggestion would be to spend, half a day a week for the next 4 weeks interviewing, people in your team, all the way to the front lines if you can. And then ask them, as you think about the performance of the team, what do you see on a day-to-day basis that, blurs or reduces your accountability, that slows you down, that wastes time, that doesn't contribute to real impact, doesn't really help customers, um, that frustrates new ideas and bold thinking, that feels kind of disempowering, that makes it difficult to reach out to people in other parts of the organization and collaborate to solve problems, that makes it difficult for you to flexibly respond to issues, and that kind of in a way erodes trust, right, and transparency. So those are the kinds of questions I would ask. And then the other question then after they give you their feedback would be, what is one thing we could do right now, right, to remove this barrier to achievement, right? And again, you can do this one-to-one retail kind of, one-to-one conversation, or you can do it, team conversation. And you can have a little template that kind of lays out these barriers and, and uh, specific issues, and then try to see where there is commonality, and where there's the real passion to change things, and maybe start working on those things. Maybe it's having fewer meetings, or maybe it's involving the whole team in thinking about the direction and the strategy for next year, right? Or maybe it's about letting teams decide a little bit more what their different roles are, or when they, how they make decisions. There are lots of things you can do. Like, you don't have to wait for the CEO to get religion. I mean, hopefully they will, but almost anybody who has as a unit, a department, or team can definitely make progress on this in their own perimeter. So I would definitely encourage people to do that. And if you're not the manager, these are the kinds of things you can have with your colleagues, and you can all self-organize this kind of discussion, and then kind of involve the manager in it. You don't have to wait for the higher ups.
Listeners, thank you for joining us today on this insightful episode with Dr. Michele Zanini. His work in management innovation, particularly through his book Humanocracy, provides us with a powerful vision of how organizations can evolve to be more nimble, entrepreneurial, and human-centered in the face of today's challenges. From challenging the bureaucratic status quo to embedding the principles of ownership, meritocracy, and experimentation, Dr. Zanini's ideas are shaping the future of work and leadership. Dr. Michele Zanini, thank you once again for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.